Okay. Recording. Share my screen. Cool. Okay. Today I'm going to be talking about mental cycles. And I watched a podcast with Joe Rogan and Andrew Huberman the other day, and I heard this fascinating quote. He said, "People suffer due to inability to control their states of mind." And that made a lot of sense to me. So what is a state of mind? I view a state of mind as similar to an emotion. You could have depression, anxiety, a flow state. There are these words that we use to describe, I guess, a collection of symptoms or collection of feelings. And it's interesting because, I can say that I feel depressed and you probably know what I'm talking about, or I can say that I feel like I'm in a state of flow and you probably know what I'm talking about. So there are these words that we use to describe a collection of symptoms or feelings that we all, or most people, commonly know. One that is really crippling for people is anxiety. But the podcast, Andrew Huberman on the podcast, structured anxiety in a different way than I am used to. He mentioned that anxiety, specifically adrenaline, we evolved to use adrenaline, or adrenaline is secreted in our body in a way to move us from stillness to action. And a lot of people are not comfortable with the feeling of adrenaline in their body. Don't blame you, because it feels like crap. But if you can overcome that in some cases, not all, you can overcome that, you can be propelled forward into action. That's what we evolved to use anxiety for. And a lot of the anxiety that we have these days is a mismatch, an evolutionary mismatch, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to be sitting there paralyzed and crippled with anxiety about your finances or something that you can't really use productively, if you will. I had raging anxiety for a couple years straight. It was horrific. I found myself in these horrible mental cycles that just would not stop, and I felt like I could not get them to stop no matter what I did. I just hated myself for keeping myself in these cycles, but I had no tools, no way to get out of these cycles. And then one day I accidentally did something that broke a horrific cycle of hypochondria. And if you suffer with hypochondria, you know how crippling it is. It sounds silly on paper, but it's horrifying when you're going through it. You believe that you are sick or you are dying or you have every illness under the sun. What I think is happening is you're trying to make sense of all of the suffering that you're going through. So what it was for me, at least, was just an overreactive response in my body to anxiety, all these symptoms, just constant nausea and weird mental symptoms and depersonalization and derealization and all of these just crazy things that my body was going through. And I think by attaching those things to an illness, to a real illness, I was trying to make sense of what I was going through. It trying to reason, trying to logic with myself. But anyway, it was a horrible cycle. It was horrible. I went to a therapy session one day, and I was telling her about what happens when I start believing I'm going to die. I'll just sit there and cry, and it was horrible. And she asked me, she said, "What are you doing to bring yourself out of this dark space?" And I sat there and I thought about it, and I'm like, nothing. I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting there festering. And so I don't know what prompted me to do this, but I went home and I wrote out the cycle of my hypochondria. And I'm going to get to this in a minute. I'm going to show you exactly what it was. But I wrote out the cycle of hypochondria, of what exactly I was doing in my brain and then physically with my body. So I wrote this out, and then I circled one place in the cycle where I'm like, I can actually take action, because almost everything else was in my mind. It was like a mental step, as I call it, very abstract. It's hard sometimes to intervene in those abstract mental states. But there was one place that I could intervene in the cycle, and that was Googling. So what would happen is, I'll explain my cycle in a second, but I would basically feel a bunch of things, a collection of symptoms, and then I would write them out in Google, like, what does a headache with nausea with, depersonalization and whatever mean? And then I would get a symptom, or I would get a diagnosis, or I would diagnose myself. I would find a condition. That's me. I'm dying. I'm going to die next week. And then I would just roll with it. And then that would bring all this anxiety. And it was just a never ending cycle. So anyway, the place that I could intervene at was the Googling step. I'm like, I can physically stop my body from Googling. I can physically stop myself from going on Google. And so what I did was just that. I went on, every time I had a urge to go on Google, I didn't. And I tallied. I put a tally. I did this for 5 days, and it was unbelievable. I wish I had the numbers. I probably could find it in one of my old journals, but what happened was the first day was really hard. I think there was something like 137 urges that I had to go on Google. And I think I caved once or twice the first day, but it was, way better than being on Google all day and feeding into that cycle. And then the next day it decreased to something like 100 or 110. And I think I maybe caved once that day. And then the next day, the tallies decreased to maybe 75. And then the next day it was like 50. And the day after that, it just kept trickling down. And then by day 5, I realized I didn't really have the urges anymore because I had stopped myself at this action step. So I didn't have these urges anymore. And then from that 5th day and on, I haven't really Googled anything. And it's almost like my hypochondria just stopped in its tracks with this thing that I did. And I was like, kind of like, whoa, I freaked out about it. And I'm like, not that it was easy, but it kind of was easy at the same time. And so I just kind of filed that away. And then fast forward a couple of years later, recently, maybe a couple of months ago, I was thinking about it again. And I started one night, I just got inspired. I don't know what inspired me to do this, but I just started writing out all of my cycles, like the hypochondria thing. I wrote out my binge eating cycle, cycles from my childhood. And then I was circling action steps. I'm like, oh, this is where I intervened. And it just made a lot of sense to me. And so anyway, I felt inspired, or I just wanted to make this video to lay out my thoughts and my ideas, and hopefully it's useful. And, show you how to figure out your own cycle and map it out and put a wrench in it, because don't we all want to do that? So, all right, states of mind and thought loops. I think I just kind of talked about that. Okay, so first what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of my cycles, what I wrote out, and so you have an understanding of what they look like. So when I was young, I got a crap ton of dentist work and doctor's visits. Well, crap ton of dentist work done, which sort of translated over to my anxiety with going to the doctor. I hated it. I basically lived at the dentist as a kid. I got everything you can possibly think of: braces, expanders, permanent teeth pulled, gum surgery, grafts, like everything. I just watched a breathing podcast with James Nestor, with Joe Rogan. I would highly recommend it. He talks about how our jaws have evolved and how they're so tiny now because we don't chew a lot of food that would build our jaws. And so therefore we have these small jaws and all these extra teeth. And it makes sense. I still kind of freak out about my dental work that I got done, because I'm like, why did I have all these teeth and why did my teeth look like that? But it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Anyway, a little off topic there. So I used to get all this dentist work done, and it gave me extreme anxiety because in hindsight, I realized my dentist was very aggressive with me. I don't feel like I was properly educated on how to care for my mouth or my teeth when I was growing up. And so I never really flossed. And, the motivation that my dentist would inject in me was fear. Like, he would get upset that my teeth would be clean or not clean or dirty. And he would just be upset with me and my parents. And in hindsight, I realized he put a lot of force into my mouth when he was working on my mouth, he would be angry and he would actually put physical force into working on my mouth. And it was really scary for me as a kid. And so I would develop all this anxiety going back, and I would go back every month for spacers and tightening my braces and checkups, and probably off more than once a month. And so it gave me a lot of anxiety. So if you look here, I would have all this anticipation. I would have this extreme anxiety. I would have this like rumination and panic, like in the days leading up to the appointment. It would just be horrible. I would dread it so much. And then I'd have the appointment. There'd be a huge release, like, oh, at least I don't have to go through this again for a little bit, right? Just this temporary release. And then the anticipation would build again and then come right back here to the extreme anxiety, and on and on and on and on. Another one is my dad's addiction growing up. He was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and he would sometimes leave for days, if not longer on end, and I wouldn't know when he was coming back. And so, I'd anticipate him leaving, get extreme anxiety, be on edge. He would actually leave. I would have this rumination, this panic, this worst case, the worst case thoughts and scenarios. Is he going to die? And all these crazy visualizations. And, I would try to attempt to convince him to come back, text him and call him. And that usually was not successful. He would come back alive, which was great. But I would get this huge temporary release, like, oh, at least he's back. At least I feel okay now. At least everything's all good in the world right now in this moment. But then time would go by and I would anticipate him leaving again, just never ending cycle. Another one, hypochondria. I already sort of explained this, but anticipate the body symptoms, get physical sensations, because the anticipation can sometimes, screw with you, and produce those physical sensations, the mind-body connection, these brain-body states. Give me extreme anxiety when I would feel these physical symptoms. I would Google them. I would self-diagnose, and I would just have this rumination around how I was going to die, when I was going to die, all these just worst-case thoughts. I would either Google or go to the doctor, sometimes urgent care, for reassurance. And when I got some sort of reassurance, like from a doctor or whatever, or even sometimes I would try to Google my way out of what I Googled myself into, as crazy as that sounds. So I'd Google to diagnose myself, and then almost Google in forums to undiagnose myself. And then I would get a huge temporary release when I had some reassurance that I was not going to die. And then I had, over time, again, anticipation of the next set of body symptoms, and then right back up here to the physical sensations again, keep going through. CrossFit. I was crazy obsessed with working out, and that is a topic for a different day. But in the sake of this video, I had a lot of anticipations with the workouts, what they would be. My coach would announce them the night before. I had crazy perfectionism. I wanted to be the best in the gym. I was obsessed with being the best. I wanted to win. And I had so much anxiety about if the workout was going to be centered around my strengths or my weaknesses, if I would in fact get the best score of the day. So I had all this anxiety around that. So much anxiety to where I couldn't sleep. I would have diarrhea. It was just horrible. I was kind of a nutcase. I still am a nutcase. And then my coach would, announce the workout. I would have all this ruminations, visualizations. Am I going to do this? Am I going to be okay? Am I going to fail? Am I going to be able to live up to my expectations, everyone else's expectations? And then I'd have all this anxiety. I would do the workout, huge temporary release again. And then, oh, it's done. At least I don't have to do this again until tomorrow. And then later that day, anticipation would build right back up to anxiety again. Last cycle for me, for an example, binge eating. Dealt with this my whole life. Finally starting to get a handle on it. Thank goodness. Feel great. So that's good. But this has taken a lot of energy from me, to say the least. So I would have obsessive thoughts about food, these intense urges and cravings for sugary foods and all the foods you can probably imagine. I would just obsess about it. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't I couldn't exist without giving into these cravings because they were so intense and hot. So then, I would ruminate about them. I would make a decision to satisfy this urge, a decision to eat whatever was on my mind. Then I had this huge temporary release once I decided to give into that urge. And then I'd have all this guilt and shame. I'm never going to do this again. The time would pass, and then my food thoughts would return, and then I'd come back and still have those urges and cravings again. Something interesting. So in this stage here, the decision to satisfy the urge. So I learned recently that dopamine is actually released when you decide to take action on something, not when you actually do the thing. So that was really interesting for me because I used to think that dopamine was released when I would actually eat, but then I started to pay attention to myself and realized, oh, the dopamine is actually released when I decided to eat, which is something to tap into, something to pay attention to in yourself. Okay, so those are all of the examples that I wrote out. Like I told you, that one night I just got randomly inspired to do that. Those were all the cycles that I wrote out, and I started to look at the cycles. So I think I can go forward. Okay, so I put all these side by side, and I started to figure out if there were any themes to this process, and there are. So you can see all these cycles. What I did was I identified in red the action step that I'm calling it. This is where I could take action. This is like my physical body. I could choose. There's a couple exceptions. So if you're looking at like my dad's addiction or the doctor or dentist, there's a couple exceptions here. But generally speaking, these are places where I or someone else could take physical action. There's always an action step, at least in this type of cycle that I'm explaining here. There's always an urge step. So that would be like this rumination, these urges, something propelling you forward to take action on the action step. So there's like the rumination, the endless thoughts and worst case scenarios here, extreme anxiety before Googling symptoms, extreme anxiety before seeking reassurance from the doctor here, extreme anxiety before the workout, these ruminations, these cravings, these urges before eating. So there's always this urge and then this action step. So that's two parts of the cycle. So when you're making your own cycle, think about this, right? So when you're writing out your cycle, oh, and then one more thing before I continue, the first and the last step need to be the same because you need to close the loop. It's never ending, right? It's like these loops that you find yourself in. So as you'll see here, anticipation, 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 anticipation. I mean, anticipation everywhere. I have anticipatory anxiety, obviously. So you have your first and your last step that are the same. You have an urge step, and then you have an action step. And then all these other steps in here are what I call mental steps. They're kind of this abstract thing going on in the background or propelling the cycle forward. And the hardest part about this, two challenging parts. I don't know about the hardest because everybody's different. So I don't know what's going to, what's hard for me is exactly going to be what's hard for you. That was a weird way to say that. But the two challenging parts are being truthful about your cycle. So being honest with yourself of what exactly you do, because, sometimes we don't want to see what we're doing, or we want to feel like, or we do feel like we're just helpless and it's, oh God, I'm cursed and, I'm not doing anything. I don't want to feel this way, but you have to be truthful about your cycle. And then, taking action. It's not easy to take action because the urges are intense. You almost feel like you have to act upon them or else, but you don't have to act upon them, which is what brings me to, well, actually I'm out of order. That was a poor transition, but I'll get there in a minute. So why is this important? Why would you want to do this? So seeing the cycle takes away power from the cycle and gives you a lot of power at the same time. So when you see something, a lot of the times it loses its charge. I heard a great quote from Jocko Willink. to turn something into less of an unknown monster, you turn the known into the unknown. A lot of the time we're just so scared of the unknown. We have these big monsters that sort of loom over our head and make us feel like we're powerless and helpless and we don't know what to do and we don't have control. But what we want to do is we want to take those unknown things and turn them into something known to us. So by writing out your cycle, you see exactly what your steps are, what you're doing, and what they're going to lead to. So you give some, you give some, I was going to say knownness. It's not a word, but you make your cycle known and you regain power. Like I was just saying, you think, oh, I don't want to be doing this, but I am, and I hate myself, and why am I here? You move from that to understanding that you are doing something, that your body and your mind is going through a process, it's going through a cycle, and why. You can see it, you can put it right in front of you. So the action step versus the mental step. So like I told you, we have the urge step, we have the action step. So the key with this is writing out your cycle, writing out whatever behavior you're in, putting it in order, writing it out, observing when you have these urges. It's easier said than done, but it's possible. Observing the urges and making a change during the action step. So basically saying, I'm not going to do this. And you could even take the practice that I did with writing, like tallying the urges. I think you would be pleasantly surprised. Like the first day or two may be hard, but as the days went on, I was shocked about how little time it took for the urges to just go away. And that's the beauty of neuroplasticity. When I did that exercise, that was the first time I think I consciously really felt the power of neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change, which was amazing. And we can do these things. It's just, we have to get through that discomfort initially, which doesn't last as long as you think it will. At least that was true for me. And another quote I found, I don't know if this is an exact quote because I actually had it written in my words, but I think it may have been a quote, or I may have taken almost the word for word and then kind of tweaked it a little bit myself. But control does not equal restraint. Control is observing and choosing not to act on something. So I used to always think that I had to tie myself down to a chair, even mentally speaking, to prevent myself from doing things like, I can't do this. I need to set hard rules for myself. I need to be a tyrant and no more of this. That never really worked out for me. What's worked better is taking a step back and just observing what I'm doing and seeing it and not really judging it and being like, okay, so this is what's happening. This is what's going on in the background of my mind or my body. And where can I intervene so I feel better? It's two different mindsets, and shifting into that non-judgmental, like, I just want to see what's going on. Here's the data and figure it out. It's just worked so much better for me. And, I'm recommending that you make changes at the action step because it seems to be the easiest, because it's something we can see and feel and tangibly look at. Like for me, it was physically going onto Google. Like I can choose to not do that, but this doesn't mean you can't make a change during a mental step. It's just more abstract. It's harder to make those changes, I found, at least. And so that's why I'm recommending a change during the action step, but it doesn't mean that you can't make a change during the mental step. So I touched upon the animal brain versus the human brain in my last video that I did on mapping the human experience. So it kind of ties in here. The only thing that can make you carry out the action is the human brain. So the animal brain is what's giving us these urges. The animal brain sometimes gets stuck with these cycles. It just wants to survive. So it's, how do I want to say this? It wants to survive, and we've figured out ways to not necessarily survive in the modern world, but it's like these cycles make us feel like we're surviving, these self-preservation cycles of, like, my whole hypochondria cycle of feeling like I was going to die. And then I feel like I self-preserve in some way by Googling. So in a way, it's a survival response, but not really. I've just trained my brain to think that it is. So the animal brain, the lower structure of the brain, is giving you these urges. It's irrational. It's on autopilot. It's not thinking. It's not the part of the brain that makes you human. That's why it's called the animal brain. It's just shooting out these urges because you feel like you need them for survival. That's in the urge step. Now, the only way that you can carry out the action is the human brain. So that's up here, your prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for learning, for reasoning, for thinking, for planning, for logic. So the only thing that can propel you forward to actually carry out the action is the human brain. But here's what's interesting. In this book I read called Brain Over Binge, I think that's what it is. I can link it in the description. But she talked about the voices of her animal brain, and I wrote out mine, and maybe you'll relate to any of these. But for example, with binge eating, but this could apply to anything. The voices that I would get would be, there won't be enough, I need more, just one more night, tonight will be the last night, or never again, this is going to be the one time, never again, this is the last time. Using global terms like always or never, like I'm never going to do this again. Every time I'm using never, psychologists will actually say when you're using global terms like always and never, usually the nervous system, like anxiety, like the anxious part of your brain is involved. What my animal brain would also do is justify why I should do something, even if I had a gut feeling against it. So sometimes I would plan to not do things, like plan to not binge eat that night. And then all of a sudden I would get this weird voice that's like, oh, but you haven't done this in a couple days, so you're fine. Like, you can enjoy a little bit, kick your feet up. And then it was just a justification to then partake in that behavior again. Same thing, a voice that tries to override a goal I previously set. It's like I'd set a goal in one state of mind, and in this other state of mind where the animal brain was trying to fuck with me, it would convince me that I should override my goal in some way. It would make sense to me, and I would be like, okay, sure, and just listen to it. It can be really challenging to sit with the urges. With hypochondria, to sit with the inability to feel like I could determine if I was going to die or not, like, to not Google, it was hard. With binge eating, it feels like you have to do it, or else, like, it's weird, like, or else you're going to die. Or with CrossFit, like, I had to do the workout for my self-worth. Like, I had to do it. I had to be the best. It's these feelings, this pressure of feeling like you have to, or else. That's a good way to determine if the animal brain is at play and if one of these cycles is at play. It's not easy, but I'm not here to tell you that it's easy. I'm here to tell you that it's possible. You can break it. You can break these cycles. Here is the exception. So if you go back to, or I go back to these first two, the doctor and dentist, my dad's addiction. Well, actually, let me back up. If you look at these last three, the hypochondria, the CrossFit, and the binge eating, these all involve just me. This is me and my own shit. So it's easy for me to take action because there's no other moving parts involved. There's no one else involved. There's me Googling, there's me doing a workout, there is me eating, okay? Here with the doctor and the dentist, my dad's addiction, this has to do with my dad. I am a bystander. This has to do with the dentist and my parents putting me through dental work at a young age. It doesn't have to do with me. I'm not making decisions. So we go back to, does the cycle involve something other than you? So if someone else is involved, you don't have full control over the action step. I just showed you the examples of my dentist work as a child or my dad's addiction. So you won't be able to make a change at the action step because you don't have full control. If you looked at my Mapping the Human Experience video, you'll see the 3 types of external events that we go through: things that we have full control over, things that we have partial control over, and then things that we have no control over. This is a partial control external event. So you aren't able to make a change at the action step. So either the other person or the external thing needs to make a change at the action step. So for example, my dad did eventually stop using drugs. It's great. And my dentist work did eventually stop. So either the thing that has control needs to make a change at that action step, or you need to make a change at a mental step. So that is the workaround that I have. If for some reason I can think of anything else, I don't really think there is at this time, I don't know, figure out a way to share it maybe. But that's what you have to work with right now if the cycle involves something other than you. And I think this brings us to an end. How do I stop? There we go. Stop share. And now it's back. Okay, cool. I hope that was useful, helpful. And I don't really have anything else to add or share. Every time I make these videos, I'm so paranoid that for some reason it didn't work and I'm going to have to do it again. But I think it worked. So, all right, I think I'm going to end it here and I will see you next time.